Well, hello, a very good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are tuning in. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very, very warm welcome to today's BA Community webinar. Now, whether you're a business analyst or a change analyst, a project manager, whether you're, well, something else, doesn't really matter. Perhaps you found yourself feeling like a bit of an outsider sometimes. The type of outsider that likes to ask difficult questions and take the contrarian position to try and ensure that the approach that a particular organization or project or product is taking is right. You might have even found yourself describing yourself as a bit of a devil's advocate at times. Well, if any of that resonates with you, or even if you want to be more of that contrarian or more of that critical friend, then we've got a real treat for you in this session. So I'm really, really pleased to say that we have someone with me who I've known online for a long time now, who very, very recently released this book, Devils in the Details, and we'll tell you about where you can get a copy of this book later on in the webinar. I read this, by the way, in about 2 or 3 sittings. It's a really, really practical field guide. Highly recommend it. So we're joined by Robert Koshinskie. To give you a little bit of detail about Robert, Robert is principal of Ringbolt Consulting, where he assists clients in product and marketing management, new product development and launch, and business analysis and strategy. He is a mentor at the NSF iCorps program and the creator and instructor for a decision-making seminar through NC State University Division of Continuing and Professional Education. So Robert, thank you very much for being here this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adrian. I really appreciate it.
Or I say this evening, this morning, I suppose, for you, but afternoon, yeah. We've probably got people in just about every time zone here. So, and just before we kick off with the conversation, a few things to mention to everyone who is tuned in live. First of all, this is very much designed to be interactive. So we have some things we're going to talk about, but if you are tuning in live, please do type in questions as we go along, and I will we'll cover as many of the questions as we possibly can. So type them in whenever a question occurs to you. I also have, and if you've been on one of these webinars before, you'll be familiar. We tend to do some sort of group note taking. So we've got something to share at the end, and you might now be expecting me to put a link to a Jamboard in the chat, but I'm going to surprise all of you. And I'm going to put a link to a mural in the chat now, so a slightly different tool for us to have a play with. And if I just share my screen very, very briefly, I'll show you when you hit that link, you will get, oh, there we go, you'll get a link to this mural board. You can zoom in and zoom out. There are some links, by the way, on the right-hand side to the book and other things. But you might want to make a point. You know, Robert might say something. You think, oh, that's a really interesting point. You just like double-click, and you can add your sort of sticky note on there and add whatever notes that you like. And there's all sorts of other things you can experiment with there as well, different colours and sizes and all that kind of thing. So do take notes as we go along. About halfway through, we'll bring this back and see what's particularly resonated with you. So that link is on. I can see lots of people joining already, which is fantastic. So, okay, so Robert, your book is entitled, or the sort of the main title is Devils in the Detail, and it sort of speaks to devil's advocacy, which is a term we probably use in a somewhat throwaway manner in business. I wondered if you're able to explain a little bit about the historical context, because I suspect that sort of underpins the modern day usage of the term.
Right, so I agree with you. Devil's advocacy depends in large part on who's referring to it. Oftentimes they refer to it as playing devil's advocate. And I talk about this in the book a little bit. Some people see that as a disbenefit because you can't effectively play devil's advocate. And I don't disagree with them. I think, however, that it is possible to be an effective devil's advocate if you can sort of embrace the role. So the origin of devil's advocacy goes back to the Roman Catholic Church around 1381 AD. And what was happening at that time was local parishes would decide if a member of the community was sort of this, embodied the holy nature of a person in the faith, and they would want them elevated to the status of a saint. The church, by the way, is very clear about this. They don't make saints. Saints express themselves through their nature and their good deeds. They simply recognize them. But what was happening was every parish wanted to have their own saint. And so it was up to the local parish to decide who was going to be recognized or not. And so around 1380, the church decided we have to get better control over this. They started to set up a program, if you will, a process for making this happen. And it followed legal format. So they had a party known as the promoter of the faith, who would act as the attorney essentially. They would review the evidence. They would present a counter case for the church to consider why this person shouldn't be elevated to the role of a saint. And because of that, the nature that they were working against the person, they were called the devil's advocate. So that's how that term came into being many years ago.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that, and I mean, one of the things that was sort of resonating with me when you spoke there, Robert, was that idea of a counter case, almost like the the sort of the critic, if you will. So how would that translate to a modern business type context?
So in the business world, the similarity, as I discussed in the book, is that it's intended to challenge a popular view. So just like the church was challenging the local parish's view about who should be recognized, and this person would come in and try to find out why that wouldn't be the case. In business, a devil's advocate does essentially the same thing. They look to see what are the decisions being made, the conclusions, what are the premises, what's the evidence, and they look to see if there's an alternate case to be made. A big difference is, however, that modern devil's advocacy, as I present it, is not another process, it's not a prescribed procedure. Rather, it's a certain attitude and certain behaviors. So the attitude that you want to try to adopt is to be open to uncertainty, to accept that much of the decision-making you're going to be making is done in an uncertain environment. And that you also have to acknowledge that everybody, including yourself, is awash in human bias and fallacy. So it's very difficult to know how we're thinking at any given moment, how rational we are, how we're being biased. And then the behaviors are what some people call informed skepticism. So this doesn't mean you just doubt everything, you don't believe that 2 + 2 = 4. This means that you're constantly on the alert where bias might be affecting a decision, where the evidence might not be good, where the argument might not be a good argument. And you're always examining the evidence and applying critical and systems thinking in how you approach a particular problem. And by the way, it's not necessarily a problem. It could also be an opportunity. So generally, devil's advocates are seen as the person who comes in to try to challenge a great idea. They could also come in to explain how what you think is a failure could be turned around. So their position is always counter to the general majority view of what they're taking a look at.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Robert. And I mean, the next question I had in my head was why is it particularly relevant in today's environment? But having heard you explain it in those terms, it seems very relevant in a professional environment, in a personal, in a political sphere, in all of those spheres, really, about ensuring that even we as individuals aren't being manipulated or misled or driven down a path we wouldn't necessarily want to go down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the two areas that I always think about in this context is the social environment, social platforms. There's been a lot of information, research done to show just how quickly misinformation and disinformation is spread across social networks, in large part because people just assume that something that reinforces their belief must be true, and they share it. They don't even take time to check the evidence. And you even see this on platforms like LinkedIn, where there's a lot of professionals, skilled professionals, who don't take the time to read past the headline to see if the headline actually reflects what the article states. So that's one area. And to your point, we've seen this here in the States in the presidential election and how COVID is being approached and the like. And then on the business side, having a lot to do with business operations. This is perhaps the worst kept secret, is that soft skills like critical thinking are very poor in the business setting. In fact, there was a recent report by IBM that stated that executives recognize this skills gap. They know it's real and it's problematic, but most of their organizations don't appear to be actively or effectively tackling the issue. Mm-hmm. So I think what sometimes happens is organizations feel that, well, if we just put another process in, we'll correct this. Yes. But the process is insufficient. That another process isn't going to correct the thinking skills issues.
Yeah, won't address that skills gap. And also, if in such a fast-moving business environment and political environment and physical environment, that we live in, there's so much variety, so much change happening at such pace. That having people that can respond to that seems so important. So that brings me on to a next theme, which I know is a theme you address in the book as well, which is this idea of best practice. And it has to be said there's a lot of talk about best practice. Well, not just these days, but there has been for a long time. And I mean, what's your take on that? And does, if something is best practice, if it's been proved, do we still need devil's advocate? Do we still need to put that through the sort of devil's advocacy lens?
Yes, so the short answer, I think, is yes. And part of the reason for that is that best practices are essentially a kind of a process, right? And in the book, I discuss different kinds of processes, what I refer to as trailing and trailblazing. And in the trailing category are those things that have in fact been used repeatedly and shown to lead reliably to the result you want. For example, if you're going hiking in the woods and you take a map and you're following a marked trail, you have pretty high confidence you're going to be able to get across the trail to where you're going. Even if a tree falls in your path, you'll be able to navigate around it. If you're doing something really innovative, you're trying to come up with the next new thing, so it's never really been done before, you might start off with some process based on a trailing process, and then come to understand that it's not sufficient. So these best practices are another kind of mental model that we use. We try to validate them to the best of our ability, and we believe that they work. That's why we follow them, right? But the problem is that oftentimes we don't know the origin of the best practice. We don't know how it came to be. We don't know who selected it as a best practice. We don't know what other kinds of best practices they considered and didn't include, and why didn't they include them. We don't know how often those best practices are challenged. So are they 10 years old? Now, if they've been around for a long while and highly valued, the fact is, as you point out, things change. So the foundation for why that was a best practice 10 years ago or 10 months ago may have changed. If it's something in sales and marketing, that may have changed. If it's something in software development, that certainly could have changed. So it's not that you should abandon the best practice. It's that you should be more, again, an informed skeptic. Why are we doing this? What is it supposed to lead us to? How are we going to check as we're following the best practice to see if it's actually leading us where we want to go? And when is it time to say, we're going to pause here and maybe take a different direction because this isn't working for us? One of the things I'll add to this, Adrian, is it seems to me that as a manager, as you become seasoned, you go through maybe 3 stages. The first stage when you're first starting out, you're just learning. So you're looking to other managers, you're taking your certificates, you're training, you're learning these things. And as you're doing whatever you're doing, you start to see, by example, you start to gain experience. And you reach a point where you probably say, if I was running this project, it would run better because I would do these things differently, right? Well, then the day comes that you're starting to get assigned your own projects, and that's kind of stage 2. And in stage 2, you're trying to go through the procedures and processes to reach a result, and you understand firsthand that rarely does it work as smoothly as the procedure and process says it should. But what you end up doing initially is you look for fault in yourself and in your team members. What did I do wrong? What did my team do wrong? How did this fail? And then eventually, with some more experience, you sort of enter the third stage, which is you come to accept that you're working in a very uncertain environment oftentimes, that the failure that you may have been attributing to yourself and others might actually be a fault with the process. And so you have to be constantly critical, not only of your own actions, but this thing that we're using, this map, this template, is it really the best template at this point in time to achieve the goal we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, yeah. Is it, or is it is it a set of practices, and methodologies that work well in a particular context, in a particular culture, at a particular period of time, that we're just trying to transplant into a very different world? And actually, the rhetoric doesn't necessarily, why would we think that something which originated over here through 20 years of tweaking, that we could take the endpoint and just expect it to work? So with that in mind, I wondered whether you're able to give any examples or more sort of other examples or points around the dangers of implementing best practice without that being scrutinized.
Well, I can think of a couple examples from my own experience, anecdotal, but maybe examples of what I'm talking about. So over the years, I've been exposed to a lot of training. I actually have built certain training and processes myself. But along the way, I had training in Lean Six Sigma. The company I was working for at the time was very big into this. So it was a requirement that everybody at a certain managerial level would go through a Lean Six Sigma program training. They brought in a black belt. She spent 2 or 3 days with us going over the whole process and procedure. And she was using case examples as part of training, which is pretty common. And I realized at one point that every case example had a successful outcome. So at a break, I said to her, have you ever applied these procedures and it didn't turn out the way you thought it would turn out? She said, yes, of course. I said, for my own benefit, I would prefer to hear more about those, because it's great that the process works occasionally, but if it also occasionally fails, then I'd like to know what caused those failures. Like, why didn't the process work in those situations? So that was one having to do specifically with Lean Six Sigma. The other one is best practices in marketing launch. The company decided that they had to get everybody working the same way in product launches. They produced this beautiful guide to product launches. It was, high-class paper, ring-bound, the whole thing, step-by-step process. And again, after we were trained in this, I tried to get an example of where somebody in the organization had actually used that process in order to achieve a good outcome. And of all the managers I'd asked, even in different divisions, no one had ever used it. No one knew anybody who had used it. So yeah, maybe it would lead to those outcomes, but there didn't seem to be any available evidence to show that I should have faith in that. So that was another example of one of these things that on the surface looked very good and could have worked, or maybe it would work, but no evidence to indicate that it actually had worked.
Yeah, plausible, but whether or not it's probable is a whole nother discussion. So, okay, so let's just pause and take a couple of questions. And if anyone wasn't here at the very beginning, I've just put a link to the shared mural that we're working on. There's quite a lot happening. I see on my other screen quite a lot of sticky notes being added, which is great. So, if you've not used Mural before, you just double click on the canvas and it'll add a sticky note. Or there's like a toolbar on the left that you can click and add various shapes and play to your heart's content. And we'll bring that on the screen in about 10 minutes time and see what you folks have added. So, and do continue to ask questions. We'll ask as many as we can. So our first question comes from John. And John says, in the example of, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this company name, but I'll try. In the example of Anheuser-Busch and IBM presented in the book, a devil's advocate is assigned. Who makes the assignment, and most importantly, how is it managed? That's a really interesting question.
Right, so I can't answer those specific cases because I actually tried to reach people in both of those companies to tell me, once again, tell me how you did this. And I haven't been successful finding those parties in those companies. I will tell you that other research I did indicates that it really depends on the culture of the company. So, for example, the company Moz, which is a search engine optimization group, the founder of that company was very open to dissent. So the culture he wanted people to be able to speak up, say whatever they thought openly, resolve the issue, because he felt it got to better results. So within a company setting, I think it can be done a variety of ways. If management is open to this idea of dissent, if they believe, by the way, as some research shows, that there's a relationship between acceptability of dissent and performance of the company, then they could approach this in a variety of ways. If the company is large enough, they could use people from a different team or a different division to come in and take a look at what's going on and report, or they could go to an outside source and they could find someone to come in. It really depends on the depth of the dissent they're looking for. For example, if you're developing one of the new vaccinations for COVID, right? Well, you probably have some thorny issues about very specific technical options that you have. So obviously you'd want someone unrelated to the project, but who could understand those thorny issues. If it's more of a business sense, like a launch of some type, it might be helpful that you have people with a specific history. For example, if you're doing medical devices, that's very different than if you're doing a consumer device. So it's a matter of finding an objective voice, giving that voice the opportunity to take a look at everything, come up with a dissenting view, and then let the team consider what they think about that dissenting view.
It's really interesting as you were speaking there, Robert. I mean, I was thinking a lot about how this really fits well with the business analysis mindset. And we probably do this without thinking. I was thinking about another term, and I forget which author. There's probably many authors have used this term, but this idea of like ritualizing, like ritual dissent. Actually encourage dissent. Have a situation where, you know what, that business case has to go through the devil's advocacy process type of thing, which is an interesting idea as well. So. We've got a sort of logistical question about the book, and the question is from Shannon. Can the book be purchased in an ebook format from a different platform other than Amazon? So I'm not sure of the answer to that, Robert.
Well, currently the answer is no. The Kindle Select program requires that the book be sold through Amazon. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be available. I think you can also obtain the book through Barnes & Noble these days too. But I know some people look for like a PDF version or something like that, and it's not yet available in that format.
So watch this space, as they say. So okay, and then Darren asks, what if the devil's advocate is too good and innovation is diminished or squashed in some capacity? I'm guessing it's a balance of the application on behalf of the inverted commas devil. So that's and to sort of springboard from what Darren's saying there, sometimes I suppose a devil's advocate might be seen as a bit of a cynic. And to add, to combine this with Rafat, who has asked a question that dissent is viewed as a waste of time and delays decisions. What's your take on that? So is it a balance? How do we avoid it being a waste of time? And how do we avoid being seen as like the cynics, that like the business prevention department type of thing?
Yeah, that's a definite challenge because, you know, again, having been a project manager, I don't want anybody coming in causing a problem that's going to make my life even more difficult. So I definitely get that. However, I think there's ways you can sort of demonstrate to the stakeholders that that's not your task. For example, you can be just upfront and say, look, let me explain what devil's advocacy is meant to do. It's not I win, you lose. It's not I'm smart, you're stupid. That's not the point. The point is to take a look at this with fresh eyes. An example I give is, not that we travel that much anymore, but in the days when we used to travel a lot, especially international trips, you're all ready to go. And your significant other might say, do you have, and then go down through this litany of things. Do you have your passport? Do you have your toothbrush? Do you have, and you know, it's kind of grating that, well, of course I have all that stuff. But in that process, it might occur to you that, oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to take a folder with me. Do I have that folder? And you open up your briefcase and it's not there, right? So that's kind of the mission of devil's advocacy. It's not to put a blemish on something or slow you down. We want you to make that trip. We want it to be a successful business trip. We just want to make sure that everything that you would need to make that success, you have, and that you've thought about these things, and you may not have thought. And by the way, we may talk about this further, but we've been talking about individual bias and blind spots, but of course there's this whole theme of groupthink where this can happen and does happen even in groups of people. And the dynamics behind that are very interesting because it has to do with fear and, diminutive position in the organization and all kinds of stuff. So you see these same kinds of bias and fallacy problems occur even in teams of highly skilled people because they're sort of isolated and they're sort of protecting their view of the world.
Yeah, definitely. Really interesting. So we have more questions coming in, so we will pause on the questions there. We will come back, so do keep those questions coming in if you're viewing live. But I just want to briefly bring up the mural, and let's have a look at what people are observing on there. So there's a fantastic number of, in fact, it's interesting you say confirmation bias, because I had noticed there was a big round, someone's found the round sticky note, and confirmation bias is on there. So we've got promote empowerment, devil's advocates are not bad actors but protectors, which is that's a really interesting perspective as well. It's not about being annoying, it's about actually helping people. Arguing for the counter position, we've got informed skepticism. It's not a procedure, read past the headlines. A couple of people have got that. In fact, 3 people. Don't apply another process about checking the evidence. Constructive dissent, mitigating groupthink. Mental models, so believing things work, so about best practices, and looking at things with a fresh pair of eyes. So lots of good ideas there starting to emerge. So just in case anyone has joined the session a little bit late, I will just now pop the link to that mural in the chat again, just in case you don't have it up on your screen. So I will just pop that in the chat for anyone who has attended a little bit later. So Robert, I mean, you were mentioning cognitive biases there. I think that's a good segue, particularly since it's slap bang in the middle of the mural as well. And I suppose a question that might be asked is, why is this devil's advocacy needed? Or I guess put differently, what is it that makes decision makers blind to certain factors, right? Because is it that we're kind of blinkered in our thinking? Is that part of the problem here?
Yeah, so I think you've hit the nail on the head that it's just human nature. As hard as it is, I'll speak for myself, to sort of accept that my view is biased in some way, or that I'm basing it on some misunderstanding of information. If you can sort of set yourself before you set off on this task to just accept that that's probably the case. I don't know where this is going to go. I'm probably biased, and let me see if I can get on top of that. So it's human bias, and it's our adoption of fallacy that leads to these problems. I give some examples in the book. One of them that I thought was really interesting, and it's been talked about a lot, is the company Theranos. So Theranos had this blood analyzing concept. They had this young woman who was very dynamic. She had a certain look. She exuded confidence. And so that was sort of an expression of one fallacy known as the halo effect, where because she seemed to have all of these positive attributes, people assumed she also had other attributes that she probably didn't have, like high technical skill. And so the halo effect in conjunction with the confirmation bias caused a bunch of people to get behind her. And these are people who you would think would have been very critical. One of them was Larry Ellison of Oracle. There was a well-known venture capital firm that got behind her. Betsy DeVos, who's our current Secretary of Education, got behind her. And Rupert Murdoch. All these people supported her, thought that this was a great idea. And they did this even though other people were saying, there's an issue here. There was a well-known Stanford Medical School professor who said, look, the technology is not anywhere near where it can do what she's saying it can do. Theranos's chief financial officer was apparently fired after questioning the reliability and the honesty of the company. So there were many issues where there was a dissenting voice that should have gotten away from this and didn't. So what happened was Theranos reached a market value, I think, of like $9 billion and then crashed. And now there's indictments and there's lawsuits and all other kind of stuff. And you can't help but wonder what would have happened if some of these dissenting voices were taken a bit more seriously and a closer examination were made.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, when you look at just about any company that's folded unexpectedly badly, or even, you start to look at I mean, even as sort of far back as the Titanic, those sorts of, tragic catastrophes, history normally records a dissenting voice that wasn't listened to, which is interesting. So you mentioned a couple of cognitive biases there. You mentioned the confirmation bias and the halo effect. Are you able to just name it, give us examples of a few others?
Yeah, it's interesting. I found one reference that listed something like, I don't know, 225 different versions. And some of these biases actually have different expressions of the bias. So one of the ones that I put right at the top of my list, because I think it is so obviously in play, is what's commonly known as the ad hominem fallacy. And what this means essentially is ad hominem means to the person. So if I make a claim, instead of challenging my claim, you challenge me, you call me names. And we see this today. We see it all the time in politics. We see it in scientific research. We definitely see it on social networks. And I was wondering, why does that happen? And it turns out that research suggests it's extraordinarily effective. So there was one article I found where they did this study where they exposed people to a claim, and then they refuted, in some cases, just the claim. In some places, they refuted just the person who made the claim. And in some places, they refuted both, right? So sometimes they attack the claim, sometimes they attack the person, and sometimes both. And what it revealed was they're all about equally effective swaying the opinion. So now consider yourself, you're a politician or you're a sales organization, wherever, and you want to change somebody's opinion. You don't even have to go look up the evidence. You don't even have to find strong counter evidence against the claim. You simply have to attack the person, and chances are pretty good you're going to sway opinion. So the ease with which people can be dissuaded through that ad hominem approach, I think, is a real wake-up call to the community today, because it affects so many things in our personal and our business lives. And again, the social networks, I don't mean to beat up on the social networks, but because of the mechanics and the dynamics of the social network, it seems to be really on fire out there right now. So if we could reel just that one fallacy back a bit and remind ourselves, look, I may not like you, but let me find out what you're saying and see if that's true. If you could just do that, that might go a long way to make things better.
Definitely, absolutely. That finding constructive ways to have debate and dialogue without bringing it to that sort of personal level. So we'll pause and take a couple of questions now. So firstly, just referring back to the voice that isn't heard before the tragedy, so the sort of Titanics, and I think in the book you used the example of the Challenger disaster and the O-ring and these sorts of things. So Hertje asks, or Hertje says, hi, you mentioned the voice that wasn't heard in a catastrophe. How do you make sure that you are being heard? And I suppose springboarding from that, adding on to Hertje's point there, like in what ways can we use devil's advocacy to overcome the types of biases that you've described there?
Right, so one of the things people have to keep in mind about the devil's advocate role is the devil's advocate is not the decision maker, right? So their role is to come in and take a look at what the general opinion is and challenge it and make the best case they can make. After that's done, it's the other party, it's the client that's going to decide, do I listen to this or not, right? So if the devil's advocate is running into issues where people are just dismissing them, they don't want to talk to them or whatever else, the first thing is to just steel yourself against that, to say, look, this is the nature of the role. This comes along with the territory. The other thing you can try to do is generally, even in a group that's somewhat resistant, one or two parties are going to give you information and they're going to be more open. And if insight can be gained through that expression, that discussion, then you have a chance to go to the other stakeholders and say, look, I know you have an issue with this, but let me tell you about a conversation I had with another member here. And this is what we found out. And if we can have more of those discussions, we might be able to avoid some problems later on. It might actually help you speed up this project. It might get you to a better success and a sooner or less money or whatever, if you're receptive and open. So it's really, it's a double-edged sword in the sense that, yeah, you want to make the best case and you hope that people listen, but at the end of the day, it's not your decision. As I say in the book, there's two chapters. One is, are you controlling what you can? Are you recognizing those things you can't control? And how people respond to you is really outside of your control. You can kind of mitigate it by doing some of these things like sharing stakeholder insights and the like, and trying to remain calm. But at the end of the day, if there's no leadership in the company that wants to do this, if there's just a lot of resistance, you might just have to say, well, that's the way it's going to be. In fact, one of the things I offer in the book in the appendices, it's a story about a devil's advocate, an actual devil's advocate of the 1900s, who I thought made an extraordinarily cogent case against the beatification of a person. And you can read that in there and see how that one turned out. So, it doesn't always turn out the way you think it's going to.
Yeah. Fantastic. And then, so kind of, we should make the case and make that compelling case. But sometimes that, if the culture's not there, then it will be tough. Thinking about how we actually do this stuff, Adeobi asks, so how do we implement devil's advocacy during, for example, a discovery workshop or requirement solicitation? So I suppose that the sort of springboarding from that question, it's like, where in the business analysis world, where do we do this stuff? Is it throughout, or is there a particular place where it fits? What would you say, Robert?
I mean, generally the advocate is brought in sort of after a decision has been made, or I should say after the case has been made, before the decision, right? Yeah. In practical terms, you might be brought in after the decision has been made and they're already going down the path and running into trouble. So my recommendation would be that there be some kind of a cross-check. So for example, if you're the BA who's doing the customer discovery part, after you complete that work, that some other BA who is not associated with it looks at it and says, oh, this looks very interesting, Adrian, but is this really the case? I mean, this looks a little weak over here, or I'm aware of some information that would sort of go against this. Is there some way that we could look further into that? So devil's advocacy, in my opinion, should be, if we can get more people adopting the attitude and practicing the behaviors, it should be an ongoing thing. Maybe not everybody, but key players in every organization should sort of be already fine-tuned to consider this approach. And so they know, as they're doing it, they know that somebody needs to check their work. And so they're not resistant to handing it over to somebody else and saying, look, take a look at this, tell me where I'm wrong. So that's kind of the culture you're trying to create. And if you can, like I say, if you can get more people to adopt the attitude and the behaviors, I'm hopeful it lowers the objection to dissent.
And I suppose when people when they see it, it's that credibility through delivery. They see it and it becomes ingrained. It becomes in the fabric of the way we do things. And you mentioned an interesting point there, Robert, which I hadn't really thought about until you said it, which is there's devil's advocacy on the big things, on the business decisions, but even just like peer review of a set of requirements. That's a form of devil's advocacy in a way. So interesting, different sort of layers, different levels. So
what? I was just going to add, Adrian, one of the things I'm reading about now is philosophy of science. One of the problems they're trying to solve is what's known as the demarcation problem, which is essentially, how do you know something's science, or if it appears to be science, but it's not, it's pseudoscience, right? And so some people who look into this, they talk about the scientific attitude, which is essentially this. It's that in pseudoscience, generally they're constantly looking to confirm their belief, and no matter what you present contrary, they're not going to change their opinion. The scientific attitude says, look, here's the best information we have now, but if you can show me, then yeah, let's give this peer review, let's find out where a better way to do this. And I think that same kind of headset, if that can be practiced in the business setting, it should give you better results, right? I mean, It just seems like it should give you better results.
Which that's really interesting, Robert, because that implies, well, implies to me at least, that when we're setting up a decision, what we should be looking for is a falsifiable hypothesis. And if we can't define a falsifiable hypothesis, then we're probably not ready to make a decision yet. Interesting. So, okay, so we'll do keep the questions coming in, and we'll take some more questions a little later. But I wanted to pivot now and talk about tools and techniques, because I mean, one of the particular areas, one of the sort of fattest areas of the book is the tools and techniques section. There's a whole bunch of techniques in there, and I really like the way that you've laid them out, in that you've given sort of practical examples and practical pros and cons of each tool or technique. So I was wondering if you could briefly outline one or a couple of tools that you think would be particularly useful for BAs when we're embracing modern devil's advocacy.
Right. So you're referring specifically to the next to the last chapter, where I go through multiple tools like list building and the like. Let me talk to that in just a moment. But prior to that, in one of the sections about bias and fallacy, I review the difference on how decisions are made in the form of what I call a real argument. So when you say an argument, people normally think people screaming at each other, right? But in a real argument, what you're doing is you are making your way to a conclusion or decision based on premises. And so it is possible, without any computer software, just a piece of paper and note-taking, is to identify a claim or a decision or a conclusion that's being made, and then through query, find out, well, what's the premise? What are you basing that on? And then on each premise, find out if there's other premises to support them and evidence. And so I recommend that approach to learners, right, that I train, to learn how to do that analysis and learn the difference in different kinds of arguments, right? So most arguments that we are going to make as business people are based on probability. So it's these premises may lead to this conclusion. They don't definitely lead to this conclusion. So if you recognize that and how to sketch that out, not only can you see it, but then you can share that with the stakeholder to say, look, this is how I think you're looking at this. Is this correct? Okay, well, I'm going to challenge this part down here because I think the evidence is weak, or I think there was a fallacy of some type. In the fourth chapter, where I go over the different kinds of techniques, what I really tried to do there was I took some common techniques. For example, I start off with diagrams and sketching and lists, weighted lists and the like. And then I make my way through some more advanced techniques all the way to the final version, which is a Monte Carlo simulation, which is kind of advanced. And the reason I do that is twofold. First, I want to show the range of analysis tools that are available to us. But more importantly, in each of those examples, I try to show what you're normally taught and the way that most people approach it, and then why you might want to think about why are you using that. Something as simple as a decision tree or net present value calculation, for example, they will all give you an answer. However, if you don't know how that answer came to be, if you don't really understand, for example, in the net present value, that generally the discount rate is fixed over the 3 or 5 years, which may not be true unless you have some kind of a banknote or something, right? If you're doing a project where you're putting money in now and you expect a certain cost of money over 5 years and well, if any of that stuff changes, the net present value is worthless. And in fact, generally speaking, alone, it doesn't tell you much. It may help you differentiate between two different projects, provided all other things are equal, right? Because projects may have, like a project may have a worse net present value, but it may be of higher strategic value to the company. So I'm trying to make the case that we shouldn't learn these things and apply a rote application, but rather every time we use these, we should be asking ourselves, okay, I have a number. What does that mean? Like, what's the usefulness of that? And that's what I was trying to do throughout 4. In fact, one of the things I will advise people, if you get the book, the Monte Carlo analysis is somewhat complicated and advanced, but I use a free tool that you can access online. And so you can actually go online and use that tool, and you can build models like these yourself. And if you do this, if you get into the habit of doing this, it might help you get away from our conventional way of doing forecasting, where the CEO says, I want to see $15 million in sales this year, right? So magically, all the spreadsheets show $15 million in sales. Well, using these tools, you can actually show a range. You can say under these conditions, we might be shy a couple $1 million. But if we can tweak these other things, we might actually be more than $15 million. So by doing this scenario analysis, even though it takes a little bit more time, you may actually be giving more useful data to the company rather than relying on traditional tools that we use.
Yeah, I found the sort of number of techniques really, really interesting, and I think I like that idea a lot of actually challenging ourselves on our use of techniques. Are we using them by rote? Should there be other techniques? And of course, we should, as practitioners, we should be open to new techniques or different techniques, and always be learning. So I suppose my next question is: could it be argued that a lot of what we do as BAs, and a lot of the traditional BA techniques actually help with devil's advocacy, at least to some extent?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I haven't looked at the BABIC in a while, but the core competency model, for example, and the transfer of techniques to methods, I think those are very useful, can be very useful, because they sort of lay out the menu, if you will, the variety of things you can do and where they might be useful. There are other, by the way, if you look around, a lot of these systems are very similar, right? So in the intelligence community, because I've been reading more about the intelligence community and how they take a look, there's this book I'm looking at now. And what this is, it's using what are known as structured analytic techniques. So it's their toolkit of taking a look at intelligence information, and they actually look at case studies. And the point that the practitioners in the intelligence community make is these techniques are not necessarily going to give you the right answer. They may not even give you any answer, right? But what they're designed to do is to break through bias and fallacy. They're designed to make you think about the problem differently and to go back and check some of what your beliefs are to see if, is there another interpretation of this? So it's been widely reported, for example, the weapons of mass destruction, and the evidence was found on aluminum tubes and this stuff, which all pointed to weapons of mass destruction. But in retrospect, what people realized was those tubes were probably casings for munitions that had been corroded for traditional munitions. And they were simply trying to upgrade those munitions. It had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction. So had people taken a step back and said, well, what else could these tubes be used for? They may have arrived at a different conclusion than the generally proposed solution. So all of these techniques, the BA techniques, the structured analytic techniques, and there's other disciplines that use these, all very useful if they actually help you break through bias and fallacy and consider an alternate view.
It's interesting, as you were talking there, Robert, I was thinking of, and I've only done a very small amount of reading in this area of cognitive behavioral therapy, but the sort of idea of asking, okay, what other possible causes are there of this? And what are the likelihood of those causes versus what my initial assumption is? It feels like there's that sort of, we initially as humans jump to conclusions. It's what we do. It's what saves us. It's what it's the reason we don't have to think. That I know that's that's a table and it's not going to collapse when I put a glass on it, type of thing. So. It seems a lot like a lot of what we've been discussing is about ensuring and assuring the quality of decisions. So I wondered, have you got any tips or tricks on decision-making methods, and how does devil's advocacy fit into those sort of decision approaches? Because I know you mentioned a few in the book.
Yeah, so I think this falls into the last section of the book. I talk about 3 different kinds of decision-making processes. The first one that everybody's been familiar with is the mandated decision, right? So you're a kid, your parents say do this, and you do it because they're in charge. In business, the CEO or somebody else in the organization might say do this. You might not even know how they came to that decision, but it's mandated. And so, essentially, if you want to keep your job, you do it. Those can make decisions very quickly, right? And some of those decisions can be good. But even a very structured organization like the United States Army, they talk about this. And they talk about the need for mandated decisions, but they advise you, try to refrain from using that. Always try to include your staff, because if you don't, you're going to miss diversity of opinion. You're going to miss other optimal solutions. So mandated decisions can get quick results, but they might not be great results. The more common way, or the other way that you see in businesses, is unanimous consensus. And in this, you're trying to get everybody on the team to agree to a certain decision. And the example I give is, if you've ever tried to make dinner arrangements, you know how challenging this can be, because I can't eat this and they don't like that. And so once you come up with a restaurant that most people seem to like, well, then you always go to that restaurant, right? So consensus decision-making, unanimous consensus decision-making, not only can take a lot of time, but it could lead to sort of a like groupthink. Like, we're always going to go to that Italian restaurant because I know that's the least headaches and we're going to be able to get in and get out of there, which means you never visit the interesting Japanese restaurant, you never check out the Persian restaurant, right? And then the third one, which I have a high interest in, is what's called consent decision-making. And this, I learned about this through a method called sociocracy in Europe. You can't use that term in the States because people think it's socialism, which is it's a hot topic here. So here in the United States, it's called dynamic governance. But essentially, this is where the attempt is made to sort of push decision-making down to the people who best make the decision. So instead of making it mandated, you try to have it made within the group. And instead of looking for agreement, you don't ask people, do you agree? What you ask is, do you object? And the reason they do this is because, well, several reasons. One is people can voice their opinion. They can object. The objection has to be what is known as a paramount objection. So it can't just be an opinion. It has to have basis in reality. So, for example, let's suppose that you're a marketing person, you want this campaign, you present the campaign to the group, and you ask, are there any objections? And the legal representative puts their hand up and says, you can't say that. There's no grounds for that. If you say that, we're going to get sued. Well, that would be a good example of a paramount. Now, you can change that then because of that objection and change the wording or whatever, at which point the legal person can say, you know what, I still don't like that campaign, but I no longer do I have an objection, so I'm not going to stand in the way. They consent. So consent decision-making can, I've found, work in the right groups because everybody gets to voice their opinion. They can walk out of there saying, boy, I don't like that, but I'm going to be able to do my job. Yeah. And that seems to be a way to keep progress going. And especially in devil's advocacy, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to create diversity and dissent. And so it lends itself better to that whole environment.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. And I'm thinking there of a particular flavor of systems thinking, soft systems methodology. And Peter Checkland writes about consensus being the special case. And he says an accommodation is much more normal, where everyone sort of accommodates the outcome. But, you know, he sort of writes as if the business world is almost kidding itself that consensus is even possible on something that's messy, because there are always sort of winners and losers type of thing. So we'll just take one final question before we look to round off and close off. So just briefly, Robbie asks, do you have to be given the role of devil's advocate, or can you assume the role without it being career limiting? Which I think is a really good question as well.
That's funny. I think if you come in and say, I'm the devil's advocate and I'm going to show you how things are done, that's probably a bad approach, right? If you are given the role or tasked the role by management, that's a little bit easier because people know that somebody has asked you to do this. That can also work against you because then you're seen as being like, you know, a puppet of management. But my point is, in the ideal world, if more people embrace the attitude of uncertainty and that recognizing the presence of bias, and they also practiced every day informed skepticism, critical thinking skills, looking at evidence, that it would happen naturally. So everybody in effect would be serving the devil's advocacy role to some level. It's kind of like getting inoculated, right? So if poor thinking skills are being transferred in the organization, the more people you can get who are interfering with that should improve the overall thinking skills of your organization, should increase diversity and dissent, useful dissent. And I think that's the way to do it. I think you can quietly practice devil's advocacy without calling yourself, without using the name. Just like consent decision making, I stop referring to that. I just use it. And through its use, people adopt the practice, and it works.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Okay, so just before we talk about how people can get hold of the book, and I should have mentioned, I'm kicking myself, that you've actually got a copy to give away to one lucky person who's on the line. So, but just before we round off, I mean, final thought: if there was one biggest takeaway or one biggest thing that you'd really want people to take away from tuning in tonight or reading the book, what would that thing be, Robert?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that I hope people consider embracing this role of the modern devil's advocate. I hope that more people consider embracing this attitude that, yeah, everything's uncertain, deterministic systems and procedures may fail us. And so we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize our own bias and fallacy. And then to say, okay, in response to that, I'm going to try to do a better job at the behaviors. I want to inform myself. I want to be skeptical, but not just for the sake of being contrarian, but I want to look into these things, examine the evidence, use critical and systems thinking, and try to get myself doing that better and everybody around me to kind of emulate. And I think if we do that, it's going to just be beneficial, not only in the business sense, but also in the public sense too.
Definitely. Completely agree, in a business sense, in a community sense, and you know, and in a broader sense as well. So fantastic. So okay, so Robert, I'm sure that people want to know how they can get hold of the book. There is a link on the mural if you're there, where you can click through on the amazon.co.uk site, and I'll put a link on the wrap up email that goes out as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, then there'll be a link in the description beneath the video. But you have, there's an upcoming discount that I think people will be able to take advantage of, Robert.
Right. So before I mention that, Adrian, the other thing you might want to share with the folks, we talked about using arguments, analyzing arguments.
Oh,
There's a free tool that I offer my students, and I'll just say this about it. It lets you practice arguments. It's very challenging because the task is to pick a hot topic and then to take the side opposite to the side you would normally argue. So it can really make your head hurt, but I think it's a useful tool. Yeah, and then we were able to set up a book promotion for 7 days on Amazon. This will be available through both Amazon.com and the UK site. And it's what they call a countdown. So if you go on it'll start on Saturday, the 14th. And for a couple of days, you'll get better than a 70% discount on the book. And then a couple of days later, the discount lowers, so the price goes a little bit higher. So by the end of the 7 days, you end up paying the full list price for the book. But that'll be available again starting Saturday and going for a week until the next Saturday.
Fantastic. So yeah, set your reminders for Saturday to get 70% off. And as I say, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, so I would highly recommend it. And in fact, I've written a review on Amazon, which I rarely do, so that's on there as well. So you have a signed copy to give away. Would you like to choose the favorite question that's been asked, or if you prefer, we could draw someone at random? Robert.
You know, we talked about uncertainty and probability. Let's go for the random. Let's pick somebody randomly and see who pops up.
So I am going to select a random number then. So let's... Google is great for this sort of thing. So, okay, let's do that. Okay, so... Okay, so the random number generator has selected John Reeves. So John Reeves, you are the winner of a signed copy of the book. I will email you because I'll have your email address from the registration. And providing you're in, because I don't know where you are, you could be anywhere in the world, providing you're somewhere that is physically delivering mail and that can accept mail from the USA, then we will get that across to you. So fantastic. Okay. So let me just close that random number generator. So great. Well, I mean, thank you so much. That's such a useful summation of so many ideas there, Robert. I'm sure also people will want to stay in touch with you. How's the best way for people to follow you? Is that on LinkedIn or?
Yeah, the two easiest ways, LinkedIn, you can find me there. And also if you go to ringbolt.net, there's a contact page and you can reach me there. And in fact, in the close of the book, I ask people, if you read the book and you see anything that just strikes you as wrong or you think differently, by all means, send it my way. That was the whole purpose, was to get people sort of taking that diverse dissenting view.
Definitely, definitely. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Robert. A really, really thought-provoking session. And a massive thank you also to everyone who has tuned in live or indeed who is watching the recording. So as a reminder, the idea behind these BA community webinars is really to talk about topics that perhaps we don't hear that often in the BA community, or to take a slightly different lens, a slightly different perspective on business analysis. And just before we close, I just want to let everyone know about a few other free upcoming events. And if you've enjoyed this webinar, you'll like these, I'm sure. So I'll be typing these in the chat. The first is the BA Open Mic Night. That's next week on the 19th of November. A very different format in that there's no fixed agenda. It's webcams on, so it's more of a meeting than a webinar, and you can attend and listen, or you can take a 3-minute speaking spot on the topic of your choosing. So if you've got a topic, you want to have a conversation about it with other BAs, that would be a very interesting session for you. Also on the 25th of November, we have the next episode of the BA Fringe. Now, if you've not come across the BA Fringe before, it's a live streamed show. It's kind of like a TV show. There will be 4 guests at least on that episode. And the 25th of November is focusing on product ownership and product management and business analysis. But we're going to have 4 slightly different perspectives on product management and product ownership. So do register for that. That regularly sells out. So do register for that one early. We've also got a webinar coming up on the 1st of December on job interview tips for business analysts as well, with a panel of experts in that regard. So all that's left to say again, Robert, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and see you next time. So bye for now.
Thanks.